The cabin's silent visitor. I had never been this far from home before. It was a long way from the comfort of my city to this small, unknown town. But with a promising job interview scheduled for the next morning, I figured it was worth the trip. Hotels were expensive, so I opted for a cheap-paying guest accommodation instead. An old cabin situated in a secluded area far from the hustle of town. It looked a bit worn, but it was clean and quiet. The owner lived elsewhere and had left me the keys, assuring me I'd have the place to myself. That first day had passed smoothly. After a long journey, I had dinner and decided to unwind by watching a movie on my laptop. The evening was peaceful, with only the occasional chirp of crickets breaking the silence. The remoteness of the cabin felt relaxing at first, a much-needed change from the city's noise. But little did I know, this quiet would soon be replaced by something far more sinister. Around 10 p.m., just as I was getting into the plot of my movie, there was a knock at the door. Startled, I paused the movie and walked to the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and it was late for any casual visitors. Standing behind the door, I called out, "Who is it?" Silence. I waited a moment, feeling uneasy, and asked again, "Who's there?" No answer. I hesitated for a few moments, listening closely. The wind whistled outside, and the trees rustled in the darkness, but there was no sound of footsteps retreating. Whoever had knocked wasn't leaving. My heart raced a little as I cautiously returned to my room, dismissing it as maybe a random passerby or prank. Settling back into my movie, I tried to shake off the unease, but before I could relax again, the same knock came. This time, it was louder. My breath caught in my throat. I felt a cold sweat form on my brow. Slowly, I walked to the door again and asked, "Who is it? Answer me." My voice sounded more anxious now. Still no answer. The silence was heavier this time, more oppressive. I leaned against the door, listening for any movement outside, but nothing. I started to feel more scared than I wanted to admit. It could be nothing, maybe some prankster, but something felt wrong. I went back to my room, but the tension was gnawing at me. My hands were trembling slightly, and I could barely focus on the movie anymore. As I sat there in the dim light of my laptop, I heard it. This time, not a knock, but a sound from the kitchen. A scraping noise, like something or someone had moved a chair or was shuffling around. I froze. The kitchen was on the other side of the cabin, and I hadn't heard anyone enter. Panic started creeping in. I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy metal lamp from the bedside table, as a makeshift weapon. Holding it tightly, I took slow, measured steps toward the kitchen. My pulse pounded in my ears. "Is someone there?" I called out, but again, no answer. The cabin felt colder all of a sudden, and the weight of the silence pressed down on me. I tiptoed closer to the kitchen, holding my breath, but before I could reach it, I heard another noise, a muffled thud, this time from the adjacent room. That room was supposed to be empty. I hadn't even opened the door since arriving. Fear gripped me harder now. It felt like I was being hunted. I darted back to my bedroom, locking the door behind me. With shaking hands, I grabbed my phone and dialed the police. I kept my voice low as I explained that someone was in my cabin. The operator asked me to stay calm and assured me that officers were on their way, but they were at least 20 minutes away. As I was still on the call, I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of movement coming from the adjacent room. My heart pounded so loudly that I thought it would give me away. There was someone in that room, and they were not being quiet anymore. I kept the phone pressed against my ear, not daring to make a sound myself. From the other side of the thin wall, I heard faint footsteps, as if someone was pacing slowly. My blood ran cold. Whoever it was, they weren't just knocking anymore. They were inside. For a moment, everything was still. Then, the doorknob to the adjacent room turned with a soft creak. I stared at the wall, every fiber of my being urging me to run, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. Suddenly, a loud crash came from the kitchen, followed by hurried footsteps. Whoever had been in the other room was now moving through the cabin with purpose. They were searching for me. I clutched the lamp tighter, retreating further into my room. My phone beeped. Low battery. I cursed under my breath. The police were still a few minutes away, and I wasn't sure I'd make it until then. Just as I contemplated my options, whether to run, hide, or fight, the footsteps stopped outside my bedroom door. I felt the air thicken with dread as I saw the shadow of feet under the door. They stood still, listening. I pressed my hand against my mouth, trying to suppress my breathing. A sudden knock came on my bedroom door, sharp and deliberate. I froze. I whispered, "Please go away," but there was no response. The door handle turned slowly. The door didn't open, but the pressure on the handle indicated that whoever was on the other side was testing it, realizing it was locked. My heart hammered in my chest as the handle clicked back into place. The feet shifted, and for a moment, everything was quiet again. Then, with a sudden burst of violence, the intruder slammed into the door with a force that shook the entire cabin. I screamed, stumbling backward, my back hitting the wall. The door creaked under the pressure, but thankfully it held. I prayed that the police would arrive soon. The sound of sirens in the distance finally broke through the terror, signaling hope. I could hear them getting closer. The intruder must have heard them too, because the footsteps retreated. The last thing I heard was the kitchen window sliding open, then silence. The police arrived minutes later, bursting into the cabin. They searched the entire area, but found no one. The kitchen window was wide open, and outside, they discovered faint footprints in the dirt leading into the woods. I was shaken, but unharmed. The police assured me they would investigate, but I knew that whoever had been inside the cabin that night was gone, and I had a terrible feeling they wouldn't be caught. The sense of being watched, hunted, had never left me. I packed up my things and left that cabin the very next day. I couldn't shake the feeling that the person who had invaded my space was still out there, watching, waiting for their next victim. To this day, the memory of that night haunts me. The knock at the door, the silence, and the unknown intruder who could have easily taken my life had the police not arrived in time. That cabin, hidden deep in the woods, may still hold secrets, ones that I was lucky to escape. Horror in the ward. Emily Stevenson had been a nurse for over 6 years, working in various hospitals and healthcare facilities. When she accepted a job at Ashgrove Geriatric Hospital, she thought it would be just another chapter in her career. Ashgrove was a small, aged facility, nestled on the outskirts of town, surrounded by thick woods that seemed to swallow it at night. The hospital's isolated location had unnerved her the first time she saw it, but Emily had always been practical. She shrugged it off, attributing the eerie feeling to exhaustion from her long shifts. Her first few weeks at Ashgrove had been relatively uneventful, but it wasn't long before things began to change. Emily had been assigned to the Alzheimer's ward, a place filled with patients whose memories had slowly faded away. Most were harmless, often caught in loops of repetitive actions, mumbling incoherent phrases, or lost in moments from decades ago. But there was one patient who stood out, a woman named Mrs. Garrett. Mrs. Garrett was in her late 70s, a petite woman with silver hair and pale blue eyes. Unlike the other patients, she wasn't simply forgetful or lost in time. She was plagued by terrifying visions. She had been at Ashgrove for years, and many nurses found her unnerving because she claimed to see things that weren't there. But Emily, empathetic and caring, tried her best to comfort the old woman whenever she worked the night shift. It was on one of these graveyard shifts that things took a horrifying turn. Emily arrived for her shift at 9 p.m., tired but ready to face another long night. She made her rounds, checking on the patients, administering medications, and ensuring everyone was settled in for the night. By 11 p.m., most of the ward was asleep, the dim lighting casting long shadows in the narrow hallways. Emily was in the linen room restocking supplies when she heard it. Mrs. Garrett's voice, faint and panicked, calling out from her room. "Please, he's here. He's watching." Emily sighed. It wasn't unusual for Mrs. Garrett to have episodes like this. She hurried to the woman's room, trying to suppress her exhaustion. When she entered, she found Mrs. Garrett sitting up in bed, her frail hands trembling as she pointed toward the corner of the room. "He's there. He's in the shadows. Watching me. Please, make him go away." Mrs. Garrett's voice was laced with fear, her eyes wide with terror. Emily looked over to the corner, her heart skipping a beat even though she saw nothing but darkness. She approached Mrs. Garrett and gently took her hand. "There's no one here, Mrs. Garrett. It's just the shadows. You're safe, I promise." No, no, you don't understand, the old woman whispered, her voice trembling. He hides in the dark. He waits. He waits until I'm alone. Emily glanced around the room again, a strange chill creeping up her spine, but she dismissed it as nerves. She sat with Mrs. Garrett until she calmed down, her breathing slowing as she eventually drifted off to sleep. Emily left the room quietly, but the feeling of unease clung to her. The rest of the night was quiet, too quiet. The eerie stillness made Emily feel as though something was lurking just out of sight, watching her. She tried to shake it off, blaming it on lack of sleep, but it felt like more than that. Around 2 a.m., as Emily was finishing some paperwork at the nurse's light station, she heard a noise, a soft, almost imperceptible sound coming from down the hall. It was coming from Mrs. Garrett's room. A cold dread settled over her as she stood up, the hairs on the back of her neck prickling. Emily walked slowly toward the room, her footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. When she reached the door, she paused, listening. The sound was faint, like a soft rustling or the scrape of something against the floor. She hesitated for a moment before opening the door. The room was empty, except for Mrs. Garrett, who was lying in bed, her eyes wide open and staring at the ceiling. But there was something else, a shadow in the corner, darker than the rest of the room, almost as if it was moving. Emily blinked, and the shadow was gone. Mrs. Garrett turned her head slowly toward Emily, her voice barely a whisper. "He's here again. Please, don't leave me alone." Emily's heart raced, but she forced a smile. "It's just a bad dream, Mrs. Garrett. There's nothing here." But even as she said the words, she didn't believe them. There was something wrong with this room, something she couldn't explain. She stayed with Mrs. Garrett for a while, but when the old woman finally fell asleep, Emily hurried out of the room, her nerves frayed. Back at the nurse's station, Emily tried to focus on her work, but her mind kept drifting back to the shadow. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, something unseen, lurking just beyond the edge of the light. It was just after 3 a.m. when the power flickered. The lights dimmed for a second, then went out completely, plunging the ward into darkness. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she fumbled for her flashlight. The hospital's backup generators kicked in a few moments later, but the dim emergency lights did little to dispel the overwhelming sense of dread that had settled over her. Then she heard it, a soft, deliberate knock coming from down the hallway. Emily froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The sound was coming from Mrs. Garrett's room. Slowly, she made her way down the hall, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. When she reached the door, she hesitated again, her hand shaking as she reached for the handle. She opened the door, and the flashlight illuminated the room. Mrs. Garrett was sitting up in bed, her eyes wide with terror. But what made Emily's blood run cold was the figure standing in the corner of the room. In the basement of Greg's modest suburban home, hidden behind a false wall, they found a secret room. The sight that greeted Sarah was worse than anything she had imagined. The walls were lined with photographs, pictures of Jessica, Emily, and other women from Briarcliff. They were candid shots, taken without the women's knowledge. Sarah's stomach churned as she realized Greg had been stalking them, cataloging their every move. But it wasn't just pictures. Greg had collected items from his victims, Jessica's locket, Emily's scarf, trophies of his conquests. His obsession had gone unnoticed for years. And there, in the corner of the room, was a list. Names of women from the town, all with dates next to them. Some had been crossed off. Jessica's name, Emily's. Others were still untouched. Greg had been planning more murders. He had more victims in mind. Greg was arrested that night. During his interrogation, he remained eerily calm, almost as if relieved that his secret had finally been uncovered. When Sarah confronted him with the evidence, Greg smirked, his eyes gleaming with a sick satisfaction. "They were never good enough," he muttered, his voice low but dripping with malice. "I just needed to make them perfect." It became clear that Greg had been driven by an insidious desire for control. He chose women who were admired, loved, and respected in the community, women who seemed untouchable. To him, their lives weren't enough, their perfection was a facade. So he killed them, believing in his twisted mind that he was punishing them for not living up to his expectations. The town of Briarcliff, though shaken, slowly began to heal after Greg's arrest. the community, once so tightly knit, had been forever scarred by the violence that had lurked within it. No one would ever look at their neighbors the same way again, and the sense of safety they once took for granted was gone. As for Sarah, she continued her work, but the image of Greg Daniels, sitting in that cold, sterile interrogation room with a smug smile on his face, would never leave her mind. She had seen many types of killers over the years, but none like Greg. He wasn't driven by anger or greed. His crimes were born from something far darker, a desire for control and a need to impose his twisted ideals on the women he stalked. Briarcliff would never forget what had happened within its quiet streets, and for Sarah, the case would serve as a haunting reminder that even the safest places could hide the darkest of secrets. The Night Stalker of Ridge Hollow. My name is David. I'm 24 years old, and I live in Ridge Hollow, a quiet and isolated farming community nestled deep in the Midwest. My family owns a small piece of land, and while it's peaceful most days, the isolation can be unsettling. My parents want me to take over the farm when they retire, but I've always dreamed of leaving this small town behind, especially after the eerie events of last summer. It was mid-July, a quiet week when my parents went on a much-needed vacation. That left me and my two younger sisters, Lisa and Emma, in charge of the farm. Lisa was always busy with her online classes, leaving Emma and me to manage the rest. It was a hot, dry evening when the strange things began. That night, Emma and I were in the living room, watching TV while Lisa worked in her room. The dogs, Rusty and Blue, suddenly went wild outside. The farm dogs usually barked at small critters, but this was different. Their deep, frantic barking sent chills down my spine. Something had disturbed them. "I'll check it out," I muttered, grabbing a flashlight. Emma looked concerned but didn't stop me. I stepped outside into the cool night, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The dogs were facing the cornfield, snarling and growling like they were ready to fight. I squinted, trying to see what they were barking at, but all I could hear was a soft whistle, a human whistle, coming from deep within the corn. Every hair on my neck stood up. I didn't dare venture into the field alone, so I hurried back inside to grab the shotgun my father kept for protection. When I told Emma what I'd heard, her face paled. "Don't go out there," she said, her voice shaky. "Just leave it. It's probably nothing." But it didn't feel like nothing. With the shotgun in hand, I returned to the porch and fired a shot into the air, hoping to scare off whoever was out there. The shot echoed through the night, silencing the dogs momentarily. I stood there, listening intently. For a moment, everything was still. Then the dogs started barking again, even more frenzied than before. I swung the flashlight toward the cornfield and felt my stomach drop. A man was standing at the edge of the field, just beyond the reach of the light. His silhouette was barely visible, but I could see the glint of his eyes as he stared at me. Without thinking, I shouted, "Get off our land!" He didn't respond. Instead, he stepped backward into the corn, disappearing without a sound. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned back to the house. I wasn't about to chase some stranger into the field in the dead of night. Inside, I told Emma and Lisa what had happened. Lisa insisted we call the police, but Ridge Hollow was so remote that it would take them over an hour to reach us. We decided to stay indoors and keep the doors locked. I brought the dogs inside, hoping their presence would calm our nerves. As the night wore on, I found it hard to sleep. The house was eerily silent, save for the occasional rustle of the wind outside. I had the shotgun by my bed, just in case. Around midnight, I heard it again, the same slow, eerie whistling, this time much closer. I shot out of bed and ran to the window. There he was, standing in the moonlight, just a few feet from the front porch. He wasn't moving, just standing there and staring up at my window. His face was shadowed, but I could see the faint outline of a grin. I grabbed the shotgun and aimed it through the window. My hands were shaking, but I pulled the trigger, firing a warning shot at the ground near his feet. He flinched, but didn't run. Instead, he took one slow step toward the house, then another. My blood ran cold. This wasn't some prank. I fired another shot, this time closer. That finally made him turn and dart back into the cornfield. I waited, heart racing, hoping he wouldn't return, but something about the way he moved, calm and deliberate, told me he would. The hours dragged on, and just as I was starting to doze off, I heard the dogs growling low from the hallway. I sprang up, clutching the shotgun. I moved toward the front door, stepping as quietly as possible. The whistling was back, this time right outside the house. It wasn't just one voice now, there were two, maybe three. "Lisa, Emma," I hissed, waking my sisters. "Get to the basement now." They didn't argue. We all hurried downstairs, locking the door behind us. I stood at the top of the basement stairs, shotgun ready. The whistling stopped. The only sound was my own ragged breathing and the creak of footsteps on the porch. Then came the knock. 3 slow, deliberate taps on the front door. My heart thundered in my chest as I pointed the gun at the door, ready to fire. Another knock, then silence. I don't know how long we stayed huddled in the basement, waiting for something to happen. Finally, the footsteps retreated, fading into the night. By dawn, I crept upstairs to check the house. Everything seemed normal. The front door was locked, no signs of forced entry. But when I stepped outside, my blood ran cold. In the soft dirt of the yard, just beneath my bedroom window, were several sets of footprints. They were large, unmistakably human, and led right to the door. Whoever they were, they had been watching us all night. And they were never alone. I packed my bags the next day. My sisters and I never found out who the men were or what they wanted, but I couldn't stay on the farm after that. Whatever Ridge Hollow used to be, it wasn't safe anymore. I haven't been back since, and I don't plan to. We decided to stay indoors and keep the doors locked. I brought the dogs inside, hoping their presence would calm our nerves. As the night wore on, I found it hard to sleep. The house was eerily silent, save for the occasional rustle of the wind outside. I had the shotgun by my bed, just in case. Around midnight, I heard it again, the same slow, eerie whistling, this time much closer. I shot out of bed and ran to the window. There he was, standing in the moonlight, just a few feet from the front porch. He wasn't moving, just standing there and staring up at my window. His face was shadowed, but I could see the faint outline of a grin. I grabbed the shotgun and aimed it through the window. My hands were shaking, but I pulled the trigger, firing a warning shot at the ground near his feet. He flinched, but didn't run. Instead, he took one slow step toward the house, then another. My blood ran cold. This wasn't some prank. I fired another shot, this time closer. That finally made him turn and dart back into the cornfield. I waited, heart racing, hoping he wouldn't return. But something about the way he moved, calm and deliberate, told me he would. The hours dragged on, and just as I was starting to doze off, I heard the dogs growling low from the hallway. I sprang up, clutching the shotgun. I moved toward the front door, stepping as quietly as possible. The whistling was back, this time right outside the house. It wasn't just one voice now, there were 2, maybe 3. "Lisa, Emma," I hissed, waking my sisters. "Get to the basement now." They didn't argue. We all hurried downstairs, locking the door behind us. I stood at the top of the basement stairs, shotgun ready. The whistling stopped. The only sound was my own ragged breathing and the creak of footsteps on the porch. Then came the knock. 3 slow, deliberate taps on the front door. My heart thundered in my chest as I pointed the gun at the door, ready to fire. Another knock, then silence. I don't know how long we stayed huddled in the basement, waiting for something to happen. Finally, the footsteps retreated, fading into the night. By dawn, I crept upstairs to check the house. Everything seemed normal. The front door was locked, no signs of forced entry. But when I stepped outside, my blood ran cold. In the soft dirt of the yard, just beneath my bedroom window, were several sets of footprints. They were large, unmistakably human, and led right to the door. Whoever they were, they had been watching us all night. And they were never alone. I packed my bags the next day. My sisters and I never found out who the men were or what they wanted, but I couldn't stay on the farm after that. Whatever Ridge Hollow used to be, it wasn't safe anymore. I haven't been back since, and I don't plan to. St. Margaret's Church. 4 friends, James, Emily, Sarah, and Luke, lived in the small town of Bridgewater, a quiet place in Somerset, England. Life in Bridgewater was peaceful, but that wasn't enough for the 4 thrill-seeking friends. They craved adventure, and often found themselves drawn to dark, mysterious places. It was James who first brought up the idea of visiting St. Margaret's Church, a long-abandoned chapel hidden deep in the woods outside town. Margaret's had a dark reputation. Once a thriving church, it was abandoned nearly 50 years ago after a series of gruesome events, disappearances, strange deaths, and the final blow, the sudden death of the church's priest, Father Hargrove, under mysterious circumstances. The townsfolk whispered that St. Margaret's was cursed, and no one had dared to go near it since. The building was now rotting away, overtaken by nature, and the woods surrounding it had grown thick and wild, making it nearly impossible to reach. But that didn't stop James from convincing the group to go. His plan was to use a Ouija board to try and contact the spirits rumored to haunt the place. Emily, Sarah, and Luke were reluctant at first, but the idea of a terrifying adventure was too tempting to resist. They set a date for the weekend and gathered the necessary supplies: a Ouija board, a pack of candles, and their mobile phones. The night finally arrived, cold and damp, as fog rolled in from the nearby moors. James picked everyone up in his old car, and they drove the few miles to the edge of the woods. The journey through the dark, winding forest was eerie enough, but nothing could prepare them for the sight of St. Margaret's when they finally reached it. The stone walls were crumbling, and vines snaked up the building like skeletal hands, gripping the decaying structure. "This is it," James said, parking the car a few yards from the overgrown entrance. His voice was brimming with excitement, but there was a nervous edge to it as well. "Looks like something out of a horror movie," Luke muttered as they climbed out of the car. Emily hugged her jacket tighter around her. "I don't know if this is a good idea." Sarah, the quietest of the group, didn't say anything. Her eyes were fixed on the church, as if it was staring back at her. "Come on, it's just an old building," James said, trying to sound confident. "Nothing's going to happen. We're just here for fun." With their candles, Ouija board, and phones in hand, the group slowly made their way into the church. The door was long gone, leaving a gaping black hole where it used to be. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of damp wood and rot. The once beautiful stained glass windows were shattered, and moonlight filtered in through the broken panes, casting eerie patterns on the stone floor. The pews were overturned and covered in dust. A large wooden crucifix still hung on the wall behind the altar, but it was tilted at a strange angle, as if it had been pushed. "This place gives me the creeps," Sarah finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Let's get this over with," Emily added, glancing around nervously. James led them to the center of the church, where they cleared a small space on the floor and set up the Ouija board. They placed the candles in a circle around them, their flickering flames casting a dull glow on the old stone walls. The silence of the church was suffocating, as if it were waiting for something. "All right, everyone ready?" James asked, pulling out his phone to record the session. Luke swallowed hard, nodding. "Let's do it." They sat in a circle, knees touching, and placed their fingers lightly on the planchette, the small heart-shaped piece of wood used to guide the answers on the board. The Ouija board was an old one, borrowed from James's older cousin, who had dabbled in the occult. It had an aged, weathered look, as if it had been used many times before. "Are we really doing this?" Emily asked, her voice quivering. "It's just a game," James replied, but even he didn't sound so sure anymore. "Okay," he continued, taking a deep breath. "Let's start. Spirits of St. Margaret's, if you can hear us, we ask you to speak to us. Are you here?" The planchette sat still on the board, unmoving under their fingers. The four friends exchanged uneasy glances. "Maybe you have to be more specific," Luke suggested, his voice betraying the nervousness they all felt. James cleared his throat. "Father Hargrove, if you can hear us, we wish to speak with you. Please show us a sign." For a few moments, nothing happened. The only sound was the faint rustle of wind through the broken windows. Then, without warning, the planchette jerked, sliding across the board. "Is someone moving it?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. "No," Emily whispered, wide-eyed. "I swear I'm not." The planchette moved slowly, deliberately, spelling out a word, D-I-E. "What the hell?" Luke said, pulling his hand back from the planchette. James grinned nervously. "It's probably just a coincidence." But then the planchette started moving again, this time faster, more erratically. It spelled out another word, Leave. "I think we should listen," Emily said, her face pale. But James wasn't ready to give up. "Father Hargrove, why do you want us to leave? What happened here?" The planchette stopped moving. The air around them felt heavy, oppressive. Suddenly, the candles flickered wildly as if blown by an unseen force. Then, in one violent motion, all the candles went out, plunging the church into complete darkness. "James," Emily shouted, her voice trembling. "Light your phone! I can't see anything." James fumbled for his phone, the screen lighting up their terrified faces. The room was eerily quiet, too quiet. Then came the footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, echoing through the church as if someone or something was walking down the aisle. The sound was coming closer. "Who's there?" Luke shouted, his voice cracking with fear. No answer. The footsteps continued, slow and steady, inching closer and closer. The four friends huddled together, frozen with terror. They pointed their phone lights toward the back of the church, but there was nothing there. Only the sound of those relentless footsteps, coming closer and closer. Suddenly, there was a loud crash. One of the pews toppled over, sending a cloud of dust into the air. Emily screamed, grabbing onto Sarah. James stood, clutching the Ouija board. "We need to get out of here," Sarah cried, her eyes wide with fear. They scrambled to their feet, panic overtaking them as they stumbled toward the exit. But just as they reached the door, it slammed shut with a deafening bang. The force of it rattled the entire building. "We're trapped!" Luke yelled, pounding on the door. "It won't open!" James frantically shined his phone light around the room, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "There's got to be another way out." But before they could move, the air grew cold, unnaturally cold. Frost began to form on the floor, creeping up the walls like icy fingers. Emily started to shiver uncontrollably, her teeth chattering as she clutched her arms. The footsteps returned, louder this time, as if whatever was in the church with them was angry. The sound echoed all around them, impossible to pinpoint. Suddenly, Luke let out a gasp. "Look," he pointed to the crucifix on the wall behind the altar. It was moving, slowly rotating until it was upside down. The sight of it filled the room with a palpable sense of dread. "This isn't right," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. "We need to go, now." In a panic, they all rushed toward the windows. James grabbed a loose stone from the floor and hurled it at the nearest window, shattering it. Without hesitation, they climbed through, cutting their hands and legs on the broken glass as they scrambled outside. The night air hit them like a wave, cold and damp. They ran through the woods, not daring to look back, the sound of footsteps following them until they reached the safety of the car. James fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking as he finally started the engine. They sped away from St. Margaret's, not stopping until they were miles from the church. None of them spoke on the drive back to Bridgewater, too shaken by what they had experienced. But one thing was clear: they would never return to St. Margaret's, and they would never play with the Ouija board again. As they reached the outskirts of town, Emily broke the silence. "What do you think that was?" James didn't answer. He knew, deep down, that they had awoken something in St. Margaret's, something dark and dangerous. But some questions are better left unanswered. The last shift. The clock on the wall flickered, its neon glow casting an eerie light over the empty aisles of Bennington's department store. It was well past midnight, and Emily was stuck on the last shift of her week. The store had closed hours ago, and she was left to count the inventory and prepare for the morning crew. The fluorescent lights hummed above her, flickering slightly as she pushed a cart filled with returned items down the aisle. The store was cavernous at night, the shelves towering over her like silent giants. Emily often found the vastness comforting, but tonight it felt different. A sense of unease settled in her stomach as she pushed the cart past rows of empty racks. She glanced at her phone, 1:15 a.m. The world outside was still and quiet, the only sound coming from the occasional clatter of her cart wheels against the tiled floor. As she moved through the clothing section, a chill ran down her spine. She shook her head, trying to dispel the creeping feeling that she wasn't alone. "Just a few more hours," she muttered to herself, forcing a smile. "You can do this." Emily turned her attention to the women's clothing racks, carefully inspecting each item for damages. She moved methodically, humming a soft tune to keep her mind occupied. But the more she focused, the more the sensation of being watched intensified. She glanced around, her heart pounding, but there was nothing unusual, just rows of clothes hanging silently. A loud crash echoed from the back of the store, and Emily froze, her breath hitching in her throat. The sound had come from the storage area, where the stock was kept. She shook her head again, convincing herself it was just the sound of falling boxes. "Get a grip, Em," she whispered to herself. "It's just the store settling." She took a deep breath and continued her work, but the unease lingered. The lights flickered again, and she couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was in the store with her. The store had a long history. It had opened in the late 1970s, and rumors circulated about strange occurrences over the years. Employees had spoken of unsettling experiences during the night shifts, things going missing, odd noises, and fleeting glimpses of movement out of the corner of their eyes. Emily had always dismissed these tales as nothing more than urban legends meant to scare new hires. But tonight, she wasn't so sure. After a while, Emily decided to take a break. She headed to the break room, pouring herself a cup of coffee and trying to calm her nerves. As she sipped, she glanced out the window, but all she could see was her own reflection staring back at her. Suddenly, her phone buzzed, jolting her out of her thoughts. It was a text from her friend Jenna. "You okay?" "Heard there was a storm coming." Emily replied quickly, reassuring her that she was fine. But as she hit send, a loud thump resonated from the front of the store, followed by a series of rapid footsteps. Emily's heart raced. "Hello?" she called out, trying to keep her voice steady. There was no answer, only silence. She stood still, straining her ears to catch any sign of life, but the store remained eerily quiet. With a deep breath, Emily set her coffee down and walked cautiously toward the front of the store, her heart pounding in her chest. The footsteps had ceased, and now it felt like the entire store was holding its breath. Maybe it was a customer, she thought, although it was nearly impossible for anyone to be there at this hour. As she reached the front, she peered through the glass doors. The parking lot was empty, illuminated only by the flickering street lamp. Just as she was about to turn back, she noticed a figure standing in the far corner of the lot, just beyond the reach of the light. The figure was dressed in dark clothing, their face hidden in the shadows. "Hey!" Emily shouted, but the figure didn't move. Her voice echoed off the walls, and for a moment she felt a chill run down her spine. "Get it together, Em," she muttered to herself, but unease twisted in her stomach. She returned to her tasks, pushing her cart through the electronics section. The faint glow of television screens illuminated the area, casting an odd light that made the products look almost alive. As she moved deeper into the aisles, the flickering lights overhead began to stutter more frequently, as if something was interfering with the electrical systems. Suddenly, the lights went out completely, plunging the store into darkness. Emily froze, her breath quickening as panic gripped her. She fumbled for her phone, using its light to navigate through the aisles. "Hello?" she called again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Anyone there?" The silence was deafening, only the sound of her own heartbeat ringing in her ears. She stumbled toward the emergency exit, but before she reached it, the lights flickered back on. When they illuminated the store again, something caught her eye. There, at the end of the electronics aisle, stood the figure from the parking lot, but now they were inside the store, staring directly at her. "Who are you?" she shouted, backing away slowly. The figure didn't respond, only tilting their heads slightly as if studying her. Emily turned to run, but collided with a display rack, sending items crashing to the ground. She quickly scrambled to her feet, but when she looked back, the figure was gone. Panic surged through her veins. She darted toward the front of the store, hoping to reach the exit and escape whatever was happening. But as she approached, the automatic doors wouldn't budge. "Come on," she yelled, pounding on the glass. They remained locked tight. She turned around, searching for another way out, but the store seemed to have transformed into a maze, the aisles shifting and twisting in ways she didn't recognize. It was as if the very layout of the department store was conspiring against her. "Stay calm, just think," she whispered to herself, trying to stave off the rising tide of fear. She recalled the layout of the store from her training. If she could just make it to the back exit, she could escape. With a determined breath, Emily raced toward the back of the store, her phone light illuminating her path. She glanced back over her shoulder, half expecting to see the figure pursuing her, but there was nothing. As she reached the stockroom, she yanked the door open and slipped inside, shutting it behind her. The stockroom was dimly lit, boxes piled high, and the air felt heavy. She could hear her own breathing echoing in the stillness as she tried to collect herself. "Okay, Emily, just breathe," she said, gripping the edge of a shelf. She felt a moment of calm, but then the sensation of being watched returned, more intense than before. She turned to scan the room but saw nothing out of the ordinary, just stacks of boxes and the flickering fluorescent lights. Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. Suddenly, a loud bang came from the stockroom door, causing her to jump. "Emily!" a voice called from the other side. It was Sarah, the store manager. "Sarah!" Emily cried, rushing to the door. "Get me out of here!" "Hold on," Sarah shouted, her voice muffled. "I'll get it open." Emily's heart raced as she waited, the sound of pounding footsteps approaching from behind her. She turned around to see the figure emerging from the shadows, their face obscured but their intent clear. "Open the door!" Emily yelled, pounding her fists against it. "Just a second," Sarah replied, struggling with the lock. The figure advanced slowly, and Emily backed away, panic flooding her mind. "Hurry, please," she screamed, but Sarah's voice faded as the door swung open. Emily stumbled out into the main part of the store, her eyes wide with terror. Close it," she shouted, and Sarah slammed the door shut behind them. "What happened?" Sarah asked, her eyes darting around. There was someone in the store. But before Emily could finish, the lights flickered again, and the figure appeared behind Sarah, standing just outside the stockroom door. "Look out!" Emily screamed, but it was too late. The figure lunged forward, grabbing Sarah and pulling her back into the stockroom. Emily reached for her, but was too far away. "Help me," Sarah's voice echoed, but the door slammed shut, cutting off any chance of rescue. "No," Emily pounded on the door, but it held firm. She felt helpless as she listened to the struggle inside, the sounds of a desperate fight echoing through the air. Thinking quickly, she grabbed a nearby fire extinguisher and smashed it against the door, trying to force it open. She could hear Sarah's cries growing fainter, drowned out by the noise of the figure overpowering her. Finally, the door cracked open, and Emily slipped inside just as the figure turned toward her. They were taller than she expected, dressed in dark, tattered clothing, their face hidden beneath a hood. A glint of metal caught her eye, a knife. "Get away from her," Emily yelled, brandishing the fire extinguisher like a weapon. The figure lunged at her, and in a split-second decision, Emily swung the extinguisher, striking them hard across the face. They staggered back, momentarily disoriented, and Emily seized the opportunity to grab Sarah's hand. "Let's go," she shouted, pulling her friend with all her strength. They dashed back toward the exit, adrenaline coursing through their veins. The figure recovered quickly, barreling after them, but Emily and Sarah reached the main entrance. "Help!" Emily screamed as they pounded on the locked doors, but there was no one to hear them. "Emily, we have to get to the back!" Sarah cried, pointing to the emergency exit sign illuminating the far wall. With no time to waste, they sprinted toward it. Emily glanced back just as the figure lunged again, their knife glinting in the harsh light. "Go!" Emily yelled, pushing Sarah ahead of her. They barreled through the door, slamming it shut behind them and locking it just in time. Breathless and terrified, they found themselves in the narrow corridor leading to the loading dock. The emergency exit door creaked ominously behind them, but they didn't stop to look back. "Where do we go now?" Sarah gasped, her voice shaking. "There's a truck outside. We can call for help," Emily urged, leading the way down the dimly lit corridor. As they reached the loading dock, Emily fumbled for her phone, her hands trembling. She glanced up just in time to see the figure emerge from the back door, a dark silhouette against the faint light of the loading bay. "Run!" Emily shouted, her heart racing as they sprinted toward the exit. They burst through the doors and stumbled into the night air, the cool breeze hitting their faces. Emily quickly pulled out her phone and dialed 911, but as she turned around to guide Sarah toward the truck, the figure was right there, blocking their path. "Get away!" Emily shouted, raising her phone like a weapon. But before she could react, the figure lunged, their knife aimed directly at her. Emily ducked just in time, and the knife grazed her arm, leaving a deep cut. "Emily!" Sarah screamed, grabbing her friend and pulling her back. "Keep running!" Emily shouted, pain surging through her arm as they darted toward the truck parked nearby. They reached it just as the figure recovered and came after them again. Emily scrambled for the door, yanking it open and practically throwing Sarah inside. "Start the engine!" she yelled, and Sarah fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking. As the figure approached, Emily grabbed a nearby metal rod, brandishing it as a makeshift weapon. "Get in!" she shouted again, her heart racing. Finally, the engine roared to life, and Sarah threw the truck into reverse, narrowly missing the figure as they lunged forward. "Drive!" Emily yelled, gripping the metal rod tightly. She could feel the adrenaline surging through her, the fear threatening to overwhelm her. Sarah slammed the truck into drive and sped away from the loading dock, leaving the figure behind as they disappeared into the darkness. "Did we lose them?" Sarah panted, her eyes wide with terror as they sped down the empty road. "I don't know," Emily replied, glancing back at the store, the looming structure growing smaller in the distance. "But we can't stop. We have to get to safety." As they drove further away, the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by exhaustion and pain. Emily felt the sting of her injury and the weight of everything that had happened. But as they raced into the night, she knew one thing for certain. This was a night she would never forget. Emily and Sarah drove on, adrenaline still coursing through their veins, both shaken and relieved to have escaped the terror that had lurked within the walls of Bennington's department store.